Do you remember? If God is with us, so who is against us?
The new situation in the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine was not ignored. Vladimir Vladimirovich, today, probably, tomorrow he will have to work this issue.
The moth in camouflage did not want to feel lonely and abandoned reading about the support of Britain, France, and Ukraine, that on the day when Trump's special envoy flew to Moscow, Putin summoned Lukashenko to him. Probably, to consult about peace.
Let's sit down at the negotiating table and end this fight. Neither the Ukrainian people, nor the Russians, nor the Belarusians need it. They need it. I cannot cite these facts. They are completely closed. Where they speak openly, high-ranking people, let them beat each other, let them fight with each other, Ukrainians, Russians. Let everyone die in this cauldron. It is high-ranking officials who are talking about it.
Hello, my name is Kateryna Solyar and there will be no usual countdown of time, because here, as in a vacuum, only one time is frozen 24 hours that left, during which Putin should roll out his wishes to stop the hot phase of the war. The Kremlin dwarf won't admit that Trump let him down. Or is it that he does not return for some other reason? But it doesn't matter. Because Putin has a lot of mouths to voice what he wants. And he wants half the world and a toy gun so that when he plays with it in the bunker, he does not inadvertently get hurt.
I can say that I myself have been in regular telephone contact with Mike Waltz lately. And yesterday he called me and informed about the main results of negotiations with the Ukrainian delegation in Jeddah. Of course, I commented on the agreement on a temporary truce. Our position on the fact that this is nothing else as a temporary respite for the Ukrainian military. Nothing else. And we believe that our goal is still a long-term peaceful settlement. We strive for this. A peaceful settlement that takes into account the legitimate interests of our country.
That is, Moscow does not want a ceasefire. You've heard that now, too, right?
Russia traditionally tries to distort reality and present itself as the main peacekeeper. This is how Ushakov's words about disinterest in a short-term ceasefire for 30 days can be interpreted. But Ushakov's words are not Russia's official refusal. The decision there is made by Putin.
That is, Ushakov is manipulating. And he demonstrates that it is Russia that wants permanent peace without a temporary ceasefire. But what is it? That's right, nothing more than manipulation in order to have a corridor of opportunities to continue the war and push through their vision of the situation. Therefore, other news services say that Putin can respond to the ceasefire proposal as early as today. After Putin's meeting with Lukashenko, their press conference took place in Moscow, at which, as Peskov said, Putin could have spoken about Ukraine, but did not do it. As I understand it, I began to wait for a meeting with Witkoff. And, most likely, the details will come later, since Peskov does not yet know whether Putin will be able to receive Witkoff today, in person, or a little later, or tomorrow, or ever. He says he has a lot of things to do. Although, again, Witkoff could not come. He would just read Bloomberg, Reuters or the Washington Post. The latter, by the way, wrote in the most detail about all Putin's wants. The Washington Post obtained access to a document from one of the institutes close to the FSB, which contains a recommendation for negotiations with the United States around Ukraine. The document was handed over to the publication by one of the European intelligence agencies. The document was drawn up about a week before the first negotiations between the United States and Russia in Riyadh on February 18. And the document sets out maximalist demands for the United States, Ukraine and Europe, and there is not a hint of compromise. So, firstly, Russia rejects Trump's idea of ending the war in 100 days. Russia believes that it cannot be implemented, and in general, a peaceful settlement cannot be achieved before 2026. Can someone tell me what they have planned for 2026? Also, Russia's task is to work to increase discord between the United States and allies, which they are also good at, thus weakening the American negotiating position on Ukraine. Work is also underway to increase tensions between the United States and China. Moscow uses not only a whip, but also a carrot. For example, it offers the United States minerals, including in the occupied territories of Ukraine. It's early to discuss changes in China's stance, but a Chinese state TV reported from Ukraine's front line for the first time. So far, of course, this does not mean anything, but this is at least the third such episode. The first is Wang Yi's speech at the Munich conference. The second is a statement by China's special envoy for Europe, Liu She, that he is impressed by the way the United States approaches the settlement and that Ukraine and Europe should be at the negotiating table. And the third is a story on Chinese state television. By the way, the other day Sergei Ryabakov and the head of the Iranian Foreign Ministry were also summoned to China to talk about nuclear weapons. But back to the article. Because by sowing discord between the United States and allies, Moscow itself intends to normalize relations with the United States, including by resuming the work of embassies. They need to move our agents closer to Washington. At the same time, Russia rejects any plans to deploy peacekeepers in Ukraine and insists on recognizing Russian sovereignty over the occupied Ukrainian territories, which is a red line for Ukraine. This is while 15 countries have expressed interest in discussing a new security architecture for Ukraine. This, by the way, was announced by the Minister of Defense of France, Lecornu. France, Britain, and Turkey are ready to send a contingent to us to guarantee a ceasefire. And it turns out that Putin does not want a 30-day truce and someone to control the permanent peace in Ukraine. He also doesn't want to. Because what? Both Ukrainians and Putin know that peace will not last long. The last ceasefire between Ukraine and the Russian Federation lasted 42 minutes.
To track these ceasefire modes, please, you can bring a contingent, which will give signals, as they say. These are measures of objective control. When they shoot at you and you see it. Okay, you can track ballistic missile launches and cruise missiles with Western satellites. And what are the consequences, above all? Russia has violated this. What will be the consequences for them? This is first, and secondly, it is very important to understand that if Ukraine begins to respond to this, so that our partners do not have any questions for us either. Because, sorry, we were not the first to start. And this, in fact, is how it has been happening in our country since 2014. We didn't start this war. But we have to live up to this. And we really wouldn't want to find ourselves in a situation when we are shot and you see this, and we can't answer. And we just, as you know, ignore it by virtue of the fact that Ukraine supports these international agreements, which were created by other countries, despite the fact that it flies at our people, at our military.
And in this case, Britain and France are discussing possible strikes on Russian facilities in the event of a breakdown of the truce by Moscow. The Franco-British project should be implemented together with the NATO alliance and its capabilities. For Ukrainian officials, the key question is how such a coalition will react if Russia violates the ceasefire. Will it respond by force to a major Russian offensive, and how quickly will it happen? The Franco-British plan is to create a force equipped with enough power to dissuade Russia from attacking again. That is, to be an instrument of deterrence. The force may include heavy weapons and stockpiles of weapons that can be urgently delivered within hours or days to help defend Ukraine. If Russia does launch a new offensive, foreigners will protect strategic facilities such as nuclear power plants. Of course, Russia does not like all this. Although, what am I talking about? In general, they never like anything. Therefore, Russia also rejects the original Kellogg Flights plan, which envisaged the preservation of the occupied territories by Russia with Ukraine's obligation not to try to return them in the future by military means. Plans to continue supplying weapons to Ukraine after any peace deal are also completely unacceptable. as well as the current size of the Ukrainian army, because a combat-ready and armed army frightens Russia. Europe, do not delay the rearmament process, because it seems that this reign is for a long time. Further, the Washington Post writes that without official recognition of the occupied territories, Russia considers it quite likely that the armed conflict will resume in the medium term, for example, after the next elections in the United States. I don't want to repeat myself, but I said this reign will last for a long time. Russia also aims to expand the buffer zone in the regions bordering the Bryansk and Belgorod regions. But, of course, not at the expense of Russian territories. Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv regions should become grey. To those four that Russia has already inscribed in its so-called constitution. And do not forget that Russia seeks to demilitarize the border with Crimea in the Ukrainian south, including the Odessa region.
They want us to withdraw almost all the troops from there, leaving only a very limited contingent. Plus without heavy weapons, without certain possibilities, without aviation. And wanting is very good. And so I think, which according to their, conventionally called, peace plan, where there is some condition for the demilitarization of Ukraine. And this, by the way, was also talked about by the American side. And that, for example, Ukraine must make certain territorial concessions. It's hard, it's unpleasant, okay, we can go for them. But at the same time, Russia must accept the fact that Ukraine will remain a very militarized country. And this is the only way for us to survive. And the fact that we will not withdraw troops from anywhere. This is the first thing. Secondly, even in world practice, the biggest example is the Korean War. When the demilitarized zone is established by both countries, which withdraw troops to each of the parts of their territory for a certain mileage. And this demilitarized zone is established. And again, using the example of Korea, I want to emphasize that the most militarized zone is precisely this demilitarized zone.
No political concessions to Ukraine, such as abandoning NATO membership or holding elections with the admission of pro-Russian parties, are insufficient for agreements. Russia seeks the complete disbandment of the current Ukrainian government. Whatever that means.
It's just nonsense. Which just once again demonstrates who is really a stumbling block on the way to establishing a just lasting peace. As a matter of fact, the same. Who is the reason for the unleashing of this massacre? As Trump likes to call this war. That is, you need to understand that, by and large, Ukraine was also not happy with the idea of this 30-day truce. And we took this step, why? In order to demonstrate in practice, not in rhetoric, but in practice, to demonstrate their readiness for further steps towards a peaceful settlement. Moreover, Zelensky even proposed his own steps. In addition to just a ceasefire for 30 days. It was also proposed to completely stop the use of long-range missiles and drones. Complete cessation of confrontation at sea. And now the Russians had to react somehow. That is, despite the fact that we say the same thing. That we, in principle, are not interested in a short-term truce. We are interested in the final solution to this war. Its completion on certain principles. And Zelensky talked about it. That security guarantees are fundamentally important to us, as a prerequisite for the end of the war. And Putin called out much more conditions.
Aren't you tired of it yet, because Russia's demands are not over? Russia rejects attempts to replace them in a peace agreement by lifting sanctions. It is not entirely clear what this benefits for Russia, the document says. Moscow believes that the effect of sanctions is too exaggerated. At the same time, Russia proposes not to deploy the Oreshnik in Belarus in exchange for the non-deployment of American medium-range ballistic missiles in Europe. And Lukashenko said that they had already agreed. So much for the agreements with Russia. And the 12th point. That is one per month. Russia proposes to stop supplying weapons to countries unfriendly to the United States in exchange for the United States stopping the supply of weapons to Ukraine. The document says that it will be difficult for Russia to implement the suspension of arms supplies to its allies, but they are ready to do so.
India has ceased to fulfill certain obligations because they had supplies, including fighter jets, and they have terminated a number of contracts since 2023, who were with Russia for the supply of weapons. And, again, the same thing is, in fact, happened with Oreshnik. We are ready to make those concessions that are worthless to us because we just can't fulfill them. This is exactly the same situation. And the supply of weapons, when Russian weapons turned out, these post-Soviet ones, which frightened the whole world. And in Ukraine it turned out to be ineffective. A number of countries terminated contracts with Russia, despite the fact that Russia has been, if I'm not mistaken, a third country since the 90s, which entered the international export of weapons as one of the key players. But at the same time, at the moment they have shown that their weapons are simply ineffective. Plus it depends on a lot of components that are supplied from abroad. And at the moment in the world they are non-competitive.
I would even say that they have already left. Because while the United States has increased its arms exports, since 2020 Russia has only reduced the supply of weapons to other countries by 64%. This is due to the war against Ukraine and, by the way, France ranked second in the world in terms of arms exports. The aggressor country Russia has reduced arms exports by almost 50% in 2 years since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The reason, of course, was Western sanctions and Moscow's change in priority to equip its own army with weapons. This is stated in a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And the report says that Russian arms exports began to decline in 2015. And 2 years later, before the full-scale invasion, i.e. 2020-2021, arms exports were lower than in any other year since the turn of the century. This was largely due to reductions in arms orders from China and India. And in the period from 2020 to 2024, Russia supplied the main types of weapons to 33 states. 3/4 of exports fell on the countries of Asia and Oceania. African countries accounted for 12%, Europe 7.5% and another 6.5% for the Middle East. Where are the enemies of the United States here? Shortly before and after the full-scale invasion, India, China, and Kazakhstan became the main buyers of Russian weapons. And it is also worth saying that Ukraine has proven what Russian weapons are worth. This is how we approached the analysis. And analyzing the document, the Washington Post experts come to the following conclusions. Putin is unlikely to directly tell Trump no. This is too much of a risk for a potential alliance with Washington. Putin may show flexibility by presenting himself as a true friend of Trump, who fully understands him. But, of course, he cannot make concessions without asking for something in return. Therefore, Russia will try to delay the negotiation process as much as possible. A simple ceasefire, as Trump wants, is not in Russia's favor. Therefore, most likely, it will not be either. Both Putin and Trump will call each other this Friday. However, taking into account everything I said above, decisions on the reaction to the proposal of the United States and Ukraine have already been made. And yesterday's appearance of Putin in the Kursk region, where he called for the recapture of this area completely, only emphasizes this. If you haven't seen Putin in camouflage, then you shouldn't look at it, because this quote from Lavrov best characterizes him.
After the ministry's statement, we had a representative in the Security Council. Our assessment is set out there in full. Why did I come here?
The same issue remains relevant for Ukrainians. What are you doing here? And when will you leave here? Because the countdown of 24 hours has